penniless wanderer, a woman ridiculed by the town for her appearance, and a wedding staged to humiliate them both in front of everyone. All of Texas laughs at them, powerful enemies ready to devour her farm, and her new husband just waiting for an opportunity to escape. But no one, absolutely no one, suspected that this humiliating marriage would shake an entire frontier. Like, comment. The name of the city you're viewing, so I know how far this story has come, and follow to the end, because the best is yet to come. The day Rowan Hale rode into Callaway Bend, he had $11 in his coat pocket, a saddle that was held together mostly by hope, and a wanted notice 2 counties behind him that he'd rather not think about. He wasn't running, exactly. Running implied a destination. Rowan was just moving, the way water moves when the land tilts, following nothing but the path of least resistance, going wherever the ground happened to slope. Callaway Bend was a smear of a town pressed flat against the South Texas plain, the kind of place that looked like it had been dropped from a height and never quite recovered. There was a main street with a barber shop, a dry goods store, 2 saloons, and a bank that wore its importance on its facade like a man who'd bought a hat 3 sizes too big. Dust moved through the street in slow, lazy spirals, even when there wasn't any wind. The horses tied to the rail outside Denton's saloon looked as tired as the town itself. Rowan tied his own horse, a brown gelding named Nothing Special, which was not a name he'd given it but had accepted as accurate, and went inside for a meal he could barely afford. He sat in the corner because corner seats were old habit, ate salt pork and beans that tasted like someone had given up halfway through cooking them, and was halfway through a cup of coffee that was really just ambition with water when the trouble started. It started as most trouble in Rowan's experience did, with someone else's problem landing in his lap. The man who came through the saloon doors was thick-necked and loud, the kind of loud that didn't need an audience because it was performing for itself. His name, as Rowan would learn in the next 10 minutes, whether he wanted to or not, was Cecil Pruitt, nephew to Aldous Pruitt, who owned the Pruitt Consolidated Land Company, which owned a substantial piece of everything in a 40-mile radius and was in the business of acquiring the pieces it didn't yet own. Cecil dropped into a chair at the center table, waved at the bartender like he owned the building, and maybe he did for all Rowan knew, and started talking the way a man talks when he knows everyone in the room has learned not to argue with him. Heard Mara Ashcroft's water pump gave out again, Cecil said to the man across from him, grinning with too many teeth. 3rd time this season. You ask me, the woman can't run a ranch any more than she can fit into a parlor chair. The men around the table laughed. It was the kind of laughter that doesn't actually find anything funny, just recognizes a cue. Her daddy should have sold to us when he had the chance, another man said. Would have spared everyone the embarrassment. Well, Cecil leaned back, hooked his thumbs in his vest. Old Thomas Ashcroft's gone now, and that ranch is going to go one of 2 ways. Either Mara sells it to us at a reasonable price, or she loses it to the bank and we buy it at a better one. Either way, Pruitt gets the Ashcroft water rights, and that little social experiment of hers ends. Rowan stared at his coffee and minded his own business with great deliberation. He was still minding it when the door opened again and a woman walked in. She was not small. She was not the kind of woman the dime novels described when they bothered describing women at all. No narrow waist, no pale, fragile hands, no quality of being decorative. She was broad-shouldered and solid, somewhere in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and clothes that were clean but not meant to impress anyone. She walked like a person who expected the ground to hold her weight and wasn't surprised when it did. The laughter in the saloon didn't stop. It adjusted. Well, look who it is, Cecil said. Come to beg for an extension on that pump, Mara? She didn't look at him. She walked to the bar, spoke quietly to the bartender. Something about a part she'd ordered, something that had apparently not arrived, and the bartender shook his head with an apologetic expression that looked genuine. 3 weeks, she said. Not angry, just stating it. Yes, ma'am. Shipping's been irregular. I'll send someone to Harwick to pick it up directly. She was already turning to leave. Send word when it clears. Cecil called after her. You know, Mara, my uncle's offer still stands. Ashcroft land would be worth a lot more with someone competent running it. She stopped, turned, looked at Cecil Pruitt with eyes that contained a quality Rowan could only describe as ancient patience. The kind of person develops when they have absorbed insults as regularly as other people absorb sunlight, and have learned it doesn't actually kill you. "Tell your uncle," she said, "that his offer is still declined." She left. The laughter followed her out the door. Cecil said something else. Something about her father's poor judgment in leaving the place to a woman built like a barn door. And the table roared, and Rowan discovered that he was standing. He wasn't sure exactly when he'd stood up. His body had made that decision without consulting him, which was a recurring problem. "That's enough," he said. The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when someone unexpected speaks. Cecil Pruitt turned and looked at Rowan the way a man looks at something he hasn't yet classified, uncertain whether it's a threat or just an inconvenience. "You got something to say, stranger?" "Already said it." Cecil's eyes moved over Rowan. The travel-worn coat, the boots that needed resoling, the $11 in his pocket that didn't show but somehow could be sensed. He smiled slowly. "You ride in on a trail horse with a broke saddle to tell me about enough? Who the hell are you?" Rowan thought about sitting back down, thought about the $11, thought about the wanted notice 2 counties back that he really didn't need attention drawn to. "Nobody worth your time," he said, and sat down. But it was too late. The room had marked him, which meant the town had marked him, which in a place the size of Callaway Bend was the same as being introduced. Well, he didn't mean to still be in Callaway Bend 3 days later. He was going to leave that evening, then the next morning, then after he'd slept one more night on a real mattress instead of trail ground. Nothing special developed a loose shoe that wanted resetting. The blacksmith wasn't free until Tuesday. One thing, then another. On the 3rd day, a man named Gerald Ashcroft found him. Gerald was Thomas Ashcroft's brother, Mara's uncle, thin as a fence rail and nervous about it, with the air of someone who had long ago decided the world was against him and had never found sufficient evidence to change that conclusion. He came to find Rowan at the boarding house where Rowan was eating breakfast and informed Rowan, without preamble, that he had created a problem. "Standing up to Cecil Pruitt in public," Gerald said, pulling out the chair across from Rowan and sitting in it without being invited. "That's got his back up. He's been asking about you." "Nothing to find," Rowan said, which was not entirely true. "Maybe not. But now you're a person of interest to Pruitt Consolidated, and that's not a comfortable position in this county." Gerald folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were large, the hands of a man who'd done physical work until some point and then stopped. "I have a proposition. I don't usually like those." "My niece," Gerald said, "needs a husband." Rowan set down his fork. "Not like that," Gerald said quickly. "Not. It's a legal matter. Business matter. Thomas left the Ashcroft Ranch to Mara outright, but there's a clause in the property deed, old language, Thomas didn't catch it when he bought the place originally, that allows a creditor challenge if the primary holder is an unmarried woman. Pruitt's lawyers found it. They're planning to use it." "That's..." Rowan searched for the word. "That's absurd." "Yes, it is. It's also Texas in 1884, and it'll hold up in a Pruitt-friendly court, which is the only kind we've got in this county." Gerald's jaw was tight. "Mara knows about it. She's been trying to find a solution for 6 months. The simplest one is a husband." Rowan heard his own voice, flat and unimpressed. "Who she doesn't actually need." "Who she doesn't actually need," Gerald agreed, "but who the deed does. A legal spouse closes the challenge. Pruitt can't use that clause if she's married. And who exactly was supposed to fill that position before you found a stranger defending her honor in a saloon?" Gerald had the decency to look uncomfortable. There were a few men who considered it. Nobody local was willing. Pruitt's people made it known that anyone who married Mara Ashcroft would find themselves frozen out of every business relationship in the county. "So you need someone with nothing to lose." "I need someone with nothing to lose," Gerald confirmed. He met Rowan's eyes. "There's a deed of conveyance. You'd receive 40 acres on the east boundary. Yours outright, no conditions. In exchange, you marry Mara, live at the ranch for a minimum of 1 year to establish legal residence, and don't cause trouble." Rowan thought about the $11, the wanted notice, the shoes on nothing special that were going to need replacing before winter. 40 acres was something. 40 acres was a thing that could be stood on. Does she know you're here? He asked. Gerald paused for just a fraction too long. She knows I'm trying to find a solution. That's not what I asked. Gerald stood up. Come out to the ranch this afternoon. Talk to her yourself. The Ashcroft Ranch was 8 miles south of Callaway Bend, and it looked, Rowan thought as he rode up the main track, like a place that was fighting for its life and knew it. The main house was solid, 2 stories, built to last, the kind of construction that spoke of someone who'd intended to stay. But the east fence was down in 2 places, patched with wire that was more intention than engineering. The pasture grass was thin where it should have been thick. There was a water trough near the barn that had a visible crack in the base, bandaged with pitch that was already starting to peel. But the barn itself was well kept, and the cattle he could see in the near pasture were good stock, better than good. And the irrigation channels running from the creek, he noticed, 3 of them, recently dug, were the work of someone who understood water management in a drought year. Mara Ashcroft was in the south pasture when he arrived, arguing with a fence post. Not the way a person argues with a fence post when they're frustrated and lost. The way a person argues with a fence post when they've identified the specific problem and are resolving it with the focused irritation of someone who has been interrupted by this particular fence post before and intends to settle the matter permanently. She looked up when she heard him approach, and he saw the moment she recognized him, the stranger from the saloon, and the particular quality of the expression that followed, which was not gratitude and not embarrassment, but something in between that seemed to be deciding which way to go. She drove the post another inch with the mallet and walked toward him. My uncle sent you, she said. Not a question. He suggested I come out. Gerald suggests things the way weather suggests storms. She pulled her work gloves off and tucked them in her back pocket. How much did he offer you? 40 acres, east boundary. She absorbed this. And what do you want? Rowan looked at her directly. She was looking at him with the same quality he'd noticed in the saloon. That ancient patience, but up close there was something else underneath it, something careful and measuring. She was not a woman who trusted easily or often, and she was not pretending otherwise. I want to know what I'd be getting into, he said. Not from your uncle, from you. She studied him for a long moment, then she said, Walk with me. They walked the south boundary, or she walked it and he walked beside her, and she talked in the blunt, efficient way of someone who had learned to communicate exactly what mattered and nothing else, because time was always short. The deed clause was real. Gerald hadn't invented or exaggerated it. Pruitt's lawyers had sent a formal letter 3 weeks ago citing the provision and advising that a creditor petition was being prepared. Her lawyer in Harwick said it would likely succeed in county court. Appeals would take time and money she didn't have. The ranch produces, she said. Not as much as it should, not yet. The droughts hurt the grass, the creek's running low, and I lost 2 ranch hands to Pruitt money in July. He paid them more to quit than I could pay them to stay. She said this without self-pity, just as data. But the breeding stock is strong. The irrigation project will double our effective pasture by spring, and I have contracts with 2 supply agents in San Antonio that will be worth 3 times what they're worth now once the herd grows. You've done the numbers. I've done the numbers. She stopped at the corner post of the south boundary and turned to look at him. What I need is a name on a piece of paper and a man living on this property for a year. I don't need a partner. I don't need advice. I don't need someone making decisions that aren't his to make. She said it without apology, but without cruelty either. What I need to know is whether you're the kind of man who can accept those terms and honor them. Rowan was quiet for a moment, looking out at the thinning grass, the shallow creek, the cattle that were good stock being held together by a woman who had more competence than resources. What do the people in town think about this? He asked. Something moved across her face. Not hurt, exactly. Something past hurt. Something that had metabolized hurt into a kind of dry, functional awareness. They think it's funny, she said. They'll think it's funnier when I'm married to a drifter nobody's ever heard of. A woman my size, she said it with no inflection, the way you'd note that the sky was blue. Marrying a man who showed up with a broke saddle and nothing to his name. Cecil Pruitt will have a fine time with it. And that doesn't bother you. What bothers me, she said, is losing this ranch. Everything else is noise. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Two people who had each in their own way been counted out, standing on thinning grass in the South Texas heat, negotiating a future neither of them had planned. All right, Rowan said. She didn't look relieved. She looked like someone checking a task off a list. The judge comes through Callaway Bend on Friday, she said. Set. The wedding was, by any measure, a small and practical event. Judge Callahan, a tired-looking man who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and seemed to have performed so many of these that the ceremony had been compressed to its absolute essential elements, stood in the courthouse anteroom on a Friday morning and read the required words while Gerald Ashcroft and a woman named Dora Finch, who worked at the dry goods store and was the only witness they could get on short notice, stood against the wall. It took 11 minutes. Word reached Denton's saloon by noon. Rowan became aware of this because he went to the saloon for lunch, and Mara had gone back to the ranch, Gerald had gone back to wherever Gerald went, and the atmosphere in the room had changed in the particular way it changes when everyone is talking about something and stops when you walk in. Cecil Pruitt was there. Cecil looked at Rowan with an expression that had moved past contempt into something more considered. The expression of a man who has been inconvenienced by a piece on the board he hadn't accounted for and is now recalculating. Heard you got yourself married this morning, Cecil said. Heard correctly, Rowan said, and sat at the bar. Mara Ashcroft. Cecil let the name sit in the air. Man must be desperate. Rowan ordered his food. You know what you've walked into, Cecil said. That ranch is a money hole. Always has been, even when Thomas was running it. Woman's been patching a sinking boat for 3 years. Only thing she's managed to build is a reputation for stubbornness and poor judgment. He paused. Course, I guess that suits you two. The men nearby laughed. Rowan ate his food. Tell you what, Cecil said, and his voice dropped slightly, got almost friendly. Come see me in a month, when the well's dry and the cattle need feed you can't pay for, and the bank's breathing down your neck. Come see me. We can talk about the East 40 you'll need to let go of to stay solvent, and maybe something can be arranged. Rowan looked at Cecil. He thought about a great many things in the space of a few seconds. The $11, the wanted notice, the 40 acres on the east boundary that were now technically his, the woman who had looked at him like he was a variable in an equation and told him she needed a name on a piece of paper. I'll keep that in mind, he said. Cecil smiled and turned back to his table. Rowan finished his food and left. He moved his things to the Ashcroft Ranch that afternoon. His things fit in 2 saddlebags and a bedroll, which meant the move took very little time. Mara showed him the room at the end of the second-floor hall, a spare bedroom, clean, functional, with a window that faced east, with the same efficient brevity with which she'd walked him around the property. Supper's at 6, she said. There's water in the pitcher. If you need anything from town, write it on the list in the kitchen. All right, he said. She left. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the east-facing window, through which he could see, at the very edge of vision, the corner of what he supposed were his 40 acres. The sun was getting low, making everything go amber and long-shadowed. Somewhere outside, a horse snorted. One of the ranch hands, there were 3 remaining, he'd been told, was crossing from the barn to the bunkhouse. He was married. He was, technically speaking, a landholder. Both of these facts felt provisional in a way he didn't entirely know what to do with. The first week was careful and quiet. They established a rhythm the way 2 strangers share a table set, with deliberate politeness and a great deal of attention to where the boundaries were. Mara rose before dawn. He discovered this on the second morning when he came downstairs at what he thought was early, before 5 o'clock, and she was already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a ledger book, working figures in a neat, small hand. She looked up when he came in, poured him coffee without being asked, and went back to her numbers without comment. He went out to see what needed doing. There was plenty. The east fence, the stretch bordering the land Gerald had granted him, needed 3 new posts and 60 feet of new wire. One of the irrigation channels had a blockage where silt had built up after the last heavy rain. Two of the cattle in the near pasture had ear problems that needed doctoring, and the barn roof had a soft spot over the east loft that would fail in the next significant weather. He fixed them. Not all at once. He was one man, and the days had finite hours, but steadily, working through the list that the property itself presented just by being looked at honestly. He didn't tell Mara what he was doing. He didn't ask for direction. He just worked, because the work was visible, and the need was clear, and he had 2 hands and more hours of daylight than things to fill them with. On Friday, 5 days in, he came in from the south pasture at midday to find Mara at the fence line he'd repaired, running her hand along the new wire, checking the tension of the posts. She stood there for a long moment with her back to him. When she heard him coming, she turned around. "You did the whole east stretch," she said. "Was down." "I know it was down. I've had it on the list for 2 months." She wasn't accusing him of anything. She was, he thought, trying to recalibrate something. "You didn't have to." "Needed doing," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He was starting to realize the primary mode of communication between them. These long, measuring looks that were actually doing quite a lot of work, more than the words. "There's a problem with the North Channel," she said finally. "The gradient's wrong. Water's not moving through it properly, and I need a second set of eyes on the upstream end." "Show me," he said. They walked out to the North Channel together, and Mara explained, with the focused clarity of someone who had been thinking about this particular problem for a long time, exactly what the water was doing and what it should be doing instead. He listened, asked 2 questions, and they stood at the upstream intake for a while without talking, both watching the water. "Needs a cutoff," he said finally, "about 40 feet upstream. You divert some of the flow through a bypass during the main irrigation hours, let the pressure equalize, and the gradient issue stops mattering," she finished. She was quiet for a moment. "That would work." "Might work. Worth trying." "Yes." She looked at the channel for another moment. "I have the materials." "I can build it on Thursday," he said. She nodded, and they walked back toward the house, and that was the most they'd talked in 5 days. But something had shifted, something small and not easily named, the way the air shifts before weather changes. The second week, the harassment started. It began small, the way things that intend to become large usually begin. A section of fence on the northwest boundary came down overnight. Clean cuts, not damage. Someone with wire cutters working in the dark. 2 of the cattle that had been pastured near the road were missing the next morning. One of the remaining ranch hands, a young man named Pete Lyle, came to Rowan before breakfast looking uncomfortable. "Found these at the gate," he said, and held out a handful of pamphlets. Cheap printed paper, the kind you could get run off in any town with a press. The pamphlet said things about the Ashcroft Ranch, about Mara specifically, that Rowan read once and didn't read again. "Where'd these come from?" he said. Pete shook his head. "Don't know, they were stuck in the gatepost when I came out." Rowan took the pamphlets into the kitchen, where Mara was at her ledger. He put them on the table. She looked at them, read them. Her face didn't change in the way you'd expect a face to change when reading something vicious written about yourself. It changed in a smaller, more controlled way. A slight compression of her mouth, a stillness that moved through her shoulders. "Pruitt's work," she said. "Looks like it." She folded the pamphlets and put them in the small iron stove in the corner of the kitchen and burned them. Then she went back to her ledger. "The North Channel bypass," she said. "You mentioned Thursday. Can you do Wednesday?" He looked at her. "Yes." "Good." She turned a page. "The fence is the more urgent problem. I'll send Pete and Caleb to the northwest boundary today. If you can ride the perimeter this morning and document where the cuts were made, exact locations, how many, I want a written record. In case of a legal complaint. In case of a legal complaint." She looked up at him. "Everything we do, Rowan, every piece of damage, every incident, we document it. Dates, descriptions, witnesses, all of it." Her voice was flat and certain. "Pruitt wants us reacting. He wants us scrambling and desperate and making mistakes. We're not going to do that." He looked at her for a long moment, at the ledger with its neat figures, at the burned pamphlets already going to ash in the stove, at the woman who had looked at something vicious written about her and turned it into fuel for a different fire entirely. "I'll ride the perimeter," he said. He intended to leave. That was still the plan. A year, the agreement, the 40 acres. He told himself this at regular intervals during those first 2 weeks, the way you remind yourself of a thing you've decided so that the decision doesn't quietly unmake itself while you're not looking. But here's what happens when you watch a person work. Mara Ashcroft worked with the kind of focus that made you understand what focus actually was. Not concentration as an effort, but concentration as a resting state, a natural orientation toward the problem at hand, whatever it was, worked until it was resolved and then set down cleanly, and the next problem picked up. She slept 5 hours. She ate meals the way other people take medicine, efficiently, without particular attention to pleasure, because food was fuel and she was running the operation. She kept books the way an engineer keeps specifications, precise, annotated, updated every evening without fail. And she was almost never wrong. That was the thing that got him. He had met people who worked hard and people who worked smart, and the hard workers usually made up in effort what they lacked in accuracy, and the smart ones usually had a way of being right that they were a little too aware of. Mara was both, which was rarer than either alone, and she carried it without any apparent awareness that it was unusual, the way some people carry perfect pitch. It was just how the world sounded to them. He started asking her questions about the irrigation design, about the breeding decisions she'd made, about the supply contracts she'd negotiated in San Antonio. She answered them the same way she answered everything, directly, with detail. Without performing expertise, she'd just as soon leave in the work. He stopped telling himself he was going to leave, not because he'd decided to stay, just because the reminder stopped working. It was the 4th Saturday that things became publicly complicated again. They had gone into town together. Mara needed to meet with her lawyer about the creditor petition, and Rowan went because it was useful to be seen in public together, and also because he had decided, without particularly announcing it to himself, that he was not going to let her walk into Callaway Bend alone when Cecil Pruitt's men were watching the road. The meeting with the lawyer, a careful, precise man named Harvey Dodd, who operated out of a single room above the hardware store, lasted an hour and a half. Harvey had news that was neither good nor bad, but complex. The creditor petition had been filed, as expected, but there was a procedural delay because the marriage had been registered correctly, and Pruitt's lawyers needed time to argue around it. "They'll argue that the marriage is non-substantive," Harvey said, "that it was entered into solely to circumvent the clause, with no genuine domestic arrangement." "What do they need to prove that?" Rowan asked. Harvey looked at him with what might have been mild surprise. Maybe he hadn't expected the question from the drifter in the travel-worn coat. "Evidence of separate habitation, separate financial arrangements, or testimony from witnesses who observed that the arrangement was entered into commercially." "Gerald?" Mara said quietly. Harvey nodded carefully. "Your uncle's involvement in the arrangement is known to some people. If Pruitt's lawyers approached him, Gerald wouldn't." She said it with more confidence than Rowan had seen her apply to anything else. "He's weak about a lot of things, but not that." Harvey nodded again, less certainly. When they left Harvey's office, they came out into the main street of Callaway Bend and directly into Cecil Pruitt and 2 of his associates who had apparently been waiting, or perhaps just happened to be there in the particular way cats happen to be in doorways. Cecil looked at them both with that same recalculating expression. Measuring something, Rowan thought, testing something. "Harvey give you good news?" Cecil said pleasantly. "We're not discussing our legal affairs in the street," Mara said, and moved to go around him. Cecil stepped slightly, not enough to block her, but enough. "You know, Mara, I want you to understand that this isn't personal. My uncle's been wanting those water rights since before your daddy bought the property. It's just business." "I know it's just business," she said. "Mine's doing fine, thank you. For now." Cecil smiled. His eyes moved to Rowan. "Your husband seems quiet today." "Usually is," Mara said. "Man of action, maybe, not words." Cecil's smile stayed fixed. "Must be a real comfort, Mara, having someone to stand up for you, given that nobody else in this town ever did." The words landed the way they were meant to. Not as an insult to her, but as a reduction, a reminder. You needed someone. You couldn't do it alone. Rowan watched Mara's face and saw the way she took that particular shot, the slight pause, the absorption, and he felt something shift in him that was not quite anger. It was more specific than anger. It was an awareness, precise and clear, of what she had been carrying on her own for 3 years and the cost of it, and what it looked like when a person was still standing after all that. "Come on," he said quietly, not to Cecil, but to Mara. She was already walking. He walked beside her, and Cecil's laughter followed them down the street, and neither of them turned around. They were a block away when Mara stopped. She put her hand briefly against the wall of the building beside her. Just a second, the way you steady yourself when your footing's uncertain, and then took it away. "You all right?" he said. She looked at him. That measuring quality again, but different now, assessing something other than competence. "Yes," she said. And then, after a pause, "Thank you for earlier. In the saloon, last week." She seemed to find the gratitude awkward, the way people do when they're not used to needing it. "You didn't have to say anything." "I know." She nodded. They walked to where the horses were tied, and she unhitched her mare with quick, practiced hands, and they rode back toward the ranch in the late afternoon light, mostly silent, in the way that silence can be either empty or full, depending on what's in it. This one wasn't empty. That night, after supper, a plain meal, beans and cornbread and dried beef, eaten quickly over the ledger she'd brought to the table, Mara looked up from her figures and said, without preamble, "The irrigation project. The second phase, expanding to the northwest pasture. I've been planning to start it in spring, but if we start in October, we'll be ready for early planting, and the pasture can carry 15 more head by next summer." She turned the ledger so he could see the figures. "The cost is the problem. I have enough for the materials, but not for the additional labor, and I can't pull Pete and Caleb off normal operations." He looked at the numbers. They were meticulous, not just costs and projections, but contingencies, alternatives. What happened if the creek ran low? What happened if the supplier's prices shifted? "I can do most of the labor," he said. "On the bypass sections, the main channel work, you can't do it alone." "No, but I've done irrigation work before. Northern Colorado a few years back. I know who does what on a crew like this, and I know the parts that need 2 people versus the parts that need 4. He studied the diagram she'd sketched in the margin. "This junction here, you've got it angled wrong. You lose about 20% of your flow." She looked at where he was pointing, said nothing for a moment. "Show me what it should be," she said. He reached across the table and made a small correction to her sketch. She looked at it. He could see her working through the hydraulics of it in her head, could actually watch the moment she confirmed it. "You're right," she said. The way she said it, plain, direct, zero performance in it, was as genuine as anything he'd heard in a long time. "It's a good design," he said. "The angle's a small thing." "Small things compound," she said. She was already redrawing the junction. They sat at the table for another 2 hours, working through the second phase plan together. Not because either of them had decided to collaborate exactly. It happened the way things happen when 2 people are both trying to solve the same problem and happen to be in the same room. By the time the lamp oil was getting low, they had a revised timeline, a materials list, a labor breakdown, and a contingency for the creek level dropping further. She looked at the finished plan and then at him. Her expression had the particular quality of someone who has found a thing genuinely useful and is revising a prior assessment. "You've done this kind of work before," she said. "Not just the labor, the planning." "Some," he said. "Where?" He was quiet for a moment. "A few places." None of it lasted. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. She closed the ledger. "We start the second phase October 3rd, she said. "All right," he said. She took the lamp from the table and went upstairs, and Rowan sat in the dark kitchen of the Ashcroft Ranch for a while, listening to the sound of the property settling around him. The creak of the house in the night wind, a horse moving in the barn, the far-off low of cattle in the east pasture. 40 acres on the east boundary, his name on a piece of paper. 1 year. Those were the terms he'd agreed to. He wasn't sure, sitting there in the dark, how well he understood his own terms anymore. The second phase of the irrigation project started on October 3rd, the way Mara had said it would, because when Mara set a date, she meant the date and not approximately the date, or sometime around then. Rowan had learned this about her inside the first 2 weeks, that her relationship with planning was not aspirational but operational, which meant that when she wrote October 3rd in the ledger, it was already done in her mind and the physical world just needed to catch up. What the physical world presented on October 3rd was a sky the color of old pewter and a north wind that had no business being that cold that early in the season, and a delivery from the supplier in Harwick that was short 14 feet of channel pipe and 2 junction fittings that Rowan had specifically confirmed twice. He found Mara in the barn when the supply wagon pulled in, and she came out and looked at the load and did the count herself without saying a word, and then she said to the driver, very evenly, "You're short 14 feet of pipe and 2 south angle fittings." The driver, a heavy-set man named Tully, who looked like he'd been having a bad week already, said the supplier had been out of stock and had sent what he had. "The order was confirmed 3 weeks ago," Mara said, "in writing." "Yes, ma'am, but I have the confirmation letter." She looked at him steadily. "When can you make the delivery complete?" Tully shifted on his seat. "Week, maybe 10 days?" "1 week," she said, "and tell Harwick Supply that if the fittings aren't here by the 10th, I'll be ordering from the outfit in San Marcos and they can find another customer for that pipe." Tully left. Mara stood in the yard for a moment looking at the incomplete load with an expression that had nothing of defeat in it, just the focused reworking of a schedule in real time. Then she turned to Rowan. "We start on the sections we have material for. The northwest spur can go in without the fittings if we sequence it right. We lose about 4 days on the main channel," he said. 3 if we work the weekend." All right. They worked the weekend. By mid-October, the second phase was running 2 days behind schedule, which Mara treated as a minor irritant, and Rowan treated as roughly miraculous given everything that had tried to stop it. The missing pipe arrived on day 8. 2 nights after it did, someone pulled the survey stakes from the northwest corner of the project site, which set them back a morning while Rowan re-established the line from the original measurements he'd written in the margin of Mara's plan. He didn't tell her about the stakes until the line was reset, which was a decision he made without particularly thinking about it. Just a recognition that the problem was already solved, and reporting it before it was solved only created anxiety without purpose. She found out anyway, because Pete Lyle mentioned it at supper. She looked at Rowan across the table. "You reset the line yourself?" "Took about 2 hours," he said. "I had the measurements. Next time tell me when it happens, not after." Her voice was flat, not angry exactly, but firm. "I need to know what they're doing so I can track the pattern." "You're right," he said. "I will." She held his eyes for a moment, then nodded and went back to eating. It was the first time she'd corrected him on anything, and the way she did it, direct, no drama, no lingering over it, was so consistent with everything else about her that he found it oddly reassuring, like a sign of basic fairness. The pattern she was tracking became clearer through October and into November. The harassment was methodical in the way that things are methodical when someone with money and patience is directing them. Never so large as to constitute clear legal provocation, always just enough to cost time and resources. Survey stakes pulled. A section of fence cut, always in a different location. Twice, anonymous letters delivered to the San Antonio supply agents suggesting that the Ashcroft operation was financially unstable and that contracts with them represented risk. Mara learned about the letters because one of the agents, a decent man named Fourier, who'd been doing business with her father for 15 years, sent her a copy with a note saying he didn't put stock in anonymous correspondence, and neither should she. She kept every letter, every incident report, every piece of documentation in a locked box in the study, organized by date and cross-referenced with a handwritten index. Rowan saw the inside of the box once when she was updating it, and what struck him wasn't the volume, which was substantial, but the precision. The way she'd annotated each incident with observable facts and separated them from inference. No Pruitt did this, just date, description, witnesses, physical evidence, the facts speaking for themselves in a row, patient and accumulating. "Harvey Dodd needs to see this," Rowan said. Harvey's seen it. He updates his copy every 2 weeks. She closed the lid of the box. It's not enough yet for a countercomplaint. We need either a witness to one of the incidents or a documented pattern long enough that the circumstantial weight becomes compelling. How long is long enough? She thought about it. Pruitt's lawyers are good. Harvey says 6 months of documented incidents, minimum, before a judge takes a pattern argument seriously. That's 6 more months of this. Yes. She locked the box and set it back on the shelf. So we document everyone. November brought 2 things. The first hard frost of the season, which killed what was left of the thinning pasture grass and forced them to start on the winter feed stores earlier than planned, and the first sign that the Ashcroft operation was beginning to turn a corner in spite of everything trying to push it back. The corner was this. A rancher named Boyd Sumter, who ran a mid-sized operation 12 miles to the east, rode out on a gray Tuesday morning and asked to speak with Mara. Rowan was fixing the south gate when Sumter rode in, and he watched the man tie his horse and go to the front door and knock. And there was something deliberate about the way he did it. Not the loose ease of a man paying a social call, but the careful formality of someone who has thought about this visit and decided to make it anyway. He went back to the gate and let it be. 40 minutes later, Mara came out to find him. Boyd Sumter wants to buy winter breeding stock, she said. Specifically the Hereford crosses. He's heard the quality is good. It is good. I know it is. Something in her voice was working to stay neutral. He's offering a fair price, better than fair. She paused. His family has been doing business with Pruitt Consolidated for 11 years. Boyd's the 3rd generation to run that operation. And he's here anyway. He's here anyway. She was quiet for a moment. I told him I'd have an answer by end of week. I need to think about whether selling him that stock creates any complications. Does it? She looked at him. It means Pruitt finds out I have a buyer he thought he'd blocked, and it means Boyd Sumter is going to have to answer for it when he does. What did Sumter say when you told him you'd think about it? He said he'd been thinking about it for a month already and figured it was time to stop. She looked out at the pasture. His exact words were that he was tired of being told who he was allowed to do business with. Rowan nodded slowly. Sell him the stock. I'm going to, she said. I just wanted to say it out loud to someone first. She went back inside and Rowan looked after her for a moment. At the straight line of her back, the way she moved across the yard with that settled certainty that was not arrogance, but was something more durable than confidence. He went back to the gate. The cold had gotten into his hands and the wrench kept slipping, and he worked slower than he wanted to for a while, thinking about things that didn't have clean edges. Boyd Sumter's purchase was not the last. Through December and into the new year, 3 more ranchers came quietly to the Ashcroft property, not with fanfare, not announcing it to anyone, but coming. A widow named Clara Hess, who ran 60 head on poor land to the south and needed a different approach to winter feeding than she'd been using. 2 brothers named Garfield and Tom Price, who wanted to talk about Mara's irrigation design because their own creek had been running low since August. A grain merchant from the town of Sackett's Well, 20 miles west, who'd heard about the San Antonio supply contracts and wanted to discuss coordinating shipments. None of them came because Mara had advertised or promoted or asked. They came because Boyd Sumter had told someone who'd told someone else that the Ashcroft stock was worth buying, and the word that travels in that direction, the quiet, practical word of one rancher to another, is the only word on the frontier that actually moves commerce. Rowan watched her handle each of them. She wasn't warm in the social sense. She didn't offer charm or flattery or the performance of hospitality that some people in her position might have leaned on. She offered information, precise, useful, honest information about what her operation was doing and why and what the results had been. She showed the Price brothers her irrigation schematics. She walked Clara Hess through the winter feeding calculations she'd developed for her own herd. She told the grain merchant from Sackett's Well exactly what her current contract terms were and what she thought a coordination arrangement could achieve. People trusted her because she didn't try to make them trust her. She just told the truth about the numbers, and the numbers held up, Pruitt noticed. The notice came in the form of a formal letter from Pruitt Consolidated's lawyers, delivered to Harvey Dodd's office in January, claiming that the Ashcroft Ranch's irrigation project had redirected water flow in a manner that adversely affected downstream properties held by Pruitt interests, and requesting injunctive relief and a survey. Harvey sent a copy to Mara with a note. "They're escalating. This is more serious than the creditor petition. Be ready." She read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it to Rowan without comment. He read it. The claim was technically specific, citing a particular section of the creek and a particular downstream property, and technically wrong, which he knew because he'd surveyed the water flow himself during the bypass construction and had the measurements. But technically, wrong and legally dismissed were different things, and the difference cost time and money. "Harvey can handle the survey response," she said, "but we need our own survey on record first, before Pruitt's man gets out there." "I can do a survey tomorrow," Rowan said. "I'll need Pete. Take Caleb, too. 3 witnesses are better than 2. She was already writing a note to Harvey. "If Pruitt's survey comes in different from yours, then someone tampered with it," he said. "Then someone tampered with it, and we have the prior record." She sealed the note. "Rowan." She said his name with a particular weight that meant she was about to say something she'd been considering for a while. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. The letter is, Harvey thinks this is them getting serious, not harassment anymore. Actual legal pressure." "I know. You agreed to a year," she said. Her eyes were steady on him. "It's been 4 months. If this gets into protracted litigation, Mara." She stopped. "I know what I agreed to," he said. "I'm still here." She held his gaze for a moment, and he saw something in her face that was not quite relief. Relief would have been too simple, but something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged what he'd said without making too much of it. "All right," she said. "Do the survey tomorrow." The survey took 2 days and came back clean. The irrigation project had not reduced downstream flow by any measurable degree. Rowan wrote the measurements in a report with Pete and Caleb's signatures as witnesses and sent it to Harvey, who submitted it to the court ahead of Pruitt's surveyor. When Pruitt's survey came back 3 weeks later claiming a 12% reduction in downstream flow, Harvey filed the discrepancy immediately and requested an independent survey at Pruitt's expense. The independent survey took 6 weeks to schedule. During those 6 weeks, the Ashcroft herd grew by 22 head. Boyd Sumter had sent 2 of his own cows for breeding on a profit share arrangement Mara had proposed. And the Northwest pasture came fully online, adding grazing capacity that had been in Mara's projections since the previous spring. Rowan stopped thinking of the 40 acres on the east boundary as the thing he was here for. He stopped thinking about it much at all, actually. It was still there, still his. He'd walked it a few times, considered it, but it had become less like a destination and more like a footnote to a story that had developed a plot he hadn't anticipated. What he thought about instead was the operation. The way it was growing, not despite everything trying to stop it, but almost because of it, as though the pressure from outside had forced a kind of efficiency and discipline on the ranch that easy circumstances might not have produced. Every attack had to be answered, and answering it cost resources, but it also required them to know the operation precisely, to know exactly where every fence line was, exactly how the water moved through every channel, exactly what each head of cattle weighed and was worth and was capable of producing. They knew their own place better than any other ranchers in the county knew theirs, because they'd had to. He told Mara this one night in February, sitting at the kitchen table after the ledger work was done, when the cold had made the house contract around them and the lamp was low. She considered it for a long moment. "My father used to say that difficulty was just the cost of knowing something for certain," she said. "I always thought that was too neat, like something you put on a sampler." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "But I think what he meant was that easy things don't teach you the edges. You only find out where the edges are when something pushes you to them." "We found a lot of edges," Rowan said. "We have." She was quiet for a moment. "The water rights case. Harvey thinks it goes to a hearing in April. If we win it, and I think we will, Pruitt loses his last legitimate legal lever. Everything after that is going to be less legitimate." "Meaning?" "Meaning he stops using lawyers and starts using other methods." She said it plainly, no dramatics. "We should be ready for that." "What does ready look like?" She set down her cup. "It looks like what we've been doing, documenting everything, Building relationships with people who aren't in Pruitt's pocket, making the ranch strong enough that a disruption can't kill it. She paused. And it looks like hiring 2 more hands, men we trust. I know someone, Rowan said. He'd been thinking about this for a while. A man named Dutch Carver he'd worked with in Colorado, steady and honest and not easily rattled. He's in Amarillo, last I heard. I can write him. Do it, she said. He wrote the letter the next morning. Dutch wrote back in 3 weeks saying he'd come and brought with him a younger man named Santos who could shoe horses and had, Dutch said, the calmest nerves of anyone Dutch had ever seen in a difficult situation, which in Dutch's experience was a rarer quality than marksmanship. They arrived in March, and the ranch crew went from 3 to 5, and something shifted in the daily weight of the operation. Not enough people to feel comfortable, but enough to feel less like they were running on borrowed time. The water rights hearing happened in April, in a courtroom in the county seat that smelled of old wood and accumulated grievances. Harvey argued the case with the careful, methodical precision that was his style, presenting Rowan's survey against Pruitt's and letting the independent survey, which had confirmed Rowan's numbers within 2 percentage points, speak for the rest. Mara sat in the gallery in the only good dress she owned, which was dark blue and not very fashionable, and watched the proceedings with the same focused attention she brought to everything, the same expression she wore when she was reading a ledger and identifying where a number didn't match. Rowan sat beside her. Pruitt's lawyer, a man named Garrett, who wore his suit like a second skin, and had the easy confidence of someone who had won cases in this courthouse before, argued for 2 hours that the independent survey was methodologically flawed, that the downstream impact was real and ongoing, and that the Ashcroft operation was conducting an expansion that threatened the established water infrastructure of the region. The judge, not Pruitt's man as it happened, but a circuit judge from 3 counties over named Whitmore, who had arrived with the flat, impersonal efficiency of someone who had no debts in this particular town, listened to both sides and took 3 days to return his ruling. His ruling dismissed Pruitt's complaint in full, affirmed the Ashcroft survey as the controlling record, and noted in his written opinion that the evidence suggested the complaint had been filed without reasonable basis. Harvey sent a messenger to the ranch with the news before Rowan and Mara had even finished the drive back. Pete Lyle was the one who ran out to meet the wagon when they pulled in, waving the note. He was 22 and not generally given to displays of enthusiasm, but he was grinning in a way that made him look younger than that. Harvey says you won, he said. Complete dismissal. Mara read the note. Her expression didn't transform. She didn't whoop or throw her hat or do any of the things the situation might have licensed. She read it twice, folded it, and held it for a moment. Good, she said. Then she climbed down from the wagon and went to the barn to check on a cow that had been showing signs of trouble since morning. Rowan stood in the yard with Pete and the note and the late April light, and he thought that was maybe the most Mara thing that had ever happened. Victory was just the score. The cow needed checking. He unhitched the wagon horse and went to help her. What followed the water rights ruling was a period of roughly 6 weeks that felt, in retrospect, like the eye of something. Not peace exactly, but a pause in which the future was being arranged in ways neither of them could quite see yet. Business expanded. The San Antonio contracts renewed at better terms because Fourier had told his associates about the lawsuit and the outcome. And businesses that were paying attention understood what that outcome meant about the Ashcroft operation's stability and viability. 2 neighboring ranches that had been struggling through the drought asked Mara about the irrigation system, and she agreed to consult on their projects for a percentage of the water access improvements. She became, without announcing it or pursuing it, the person other people came to with problems. Rowan watched this happen and thought about what it cost her. Not in time or resources, though it cost those too, but in the specific tax that being useful to people extracts from a person who has spent years being dismissed by them. He watched her sit across from men who had laughed at Cecil Pruitt's jokes about her, who had looked through her in town like she wasn't there, and answer their questions with the same directness she'd always had, giving them the benefit of her hard-won knowledge without making them pay for having been wrong about her. He mentioned it to her once, obliquely, on a quiet evening in May when the worst of the heat hadn't arrived yet, and the new pasture grass was coming in thick and green in the northwest section. "You don't hold it against them," he said. "The ones who laughed." She looked at him. "Hold it against them how? Refuse to do business?" "Some people would. Some people can afford to." She was quiet for a moment. "I need this region to work, not just my ranch, the whole region. If the people around me are struggling, the supply routes break down, the market prices drop, the roads don't get maintained. I'm not separate from this place. What happens to Boyd Sumter's ranch or Clara Hess's operation, it matters to me whether I like them or not." She paused. "And most of them aren't bad people. They just follow whatever looks strong. That's human. Not admirable, but human." "You're more generous about it than I'd be," he said. "I'm not generous," she said. "I'm practical." He looked at her. The evening light was doing something kind to the yard, making the new grass look almost lush, making the rebuilt fence lines look solid. She was looking out at it with an expression he'd seen on her face before. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of ownership that wasn't about possession. More like, "I made this. I understand what it cost." "Mara," he said. Her name, just that. She turned. "What you've built here," he said. "What you've done this year. I want you to know that I—" He stopped, because what he meant to say and what he was finding words for were two slightly different things, and the gap between them was where the real thing lived. "I've worked alongside a lot of people," he said finally. "I've never seen anyone do what you do." She looked at him for a long moment. The expression on her face was complicated in a way he was only beginning to learn how to read. Not closed, but careful, the way a person is careful with something they want to get right. "You're not what I expected," she said, "when Gerald told me about you." "What did Gerald tell you?" "That you were a drifter with nothing to his name who'd stood up to Cecil Pruitt in a saloon." A pause. "He made it sound like you were an act of desperation." "I was," Rowan said. "Maybe." She held his gaze. "You don't feel like one anymore." The evening light held them both in the yard for a moment. Two people standing on ground they'd both fought for, on a ranch that had no business still being standing, having a conversation that had no clear category because it wasn't quite business and wasn't quite something else yet either. Then, from the barn, one of the cows made a loud and entirely unromantic noise, and Santos called out that the water trough in the south paddock was draining wrong and could someone come look. Mara's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, just the edge of one. "I'll go," she said. "I'll come with you," he said. They went, and the evening closed around them, and the ranch held its ground the way it always did, imperfectly, stubbornly, one fixed problem at a time. But somewhere south of Callaway Bend, in the offices of Pruitt Consolidated Land Company, Aldous Pruitt was done with lawyers and surveys and slow pressure. He was reading a report about the April ruling and the new supply contracts and Boyd Sumter's breeding arrangement and the two ranches that had asked Mara Ashcroft for irrigation consultation. And the expression on his face was not the face of a man who had decided to let something go. It was the face of a man who had decided to stop being subtle. The warning came from Boyd Sumter, and it came at 2 a.m, which told Rowan everything he needed to know about how seriously Boyd was taking it. Boyd rode in hard, his horse blowing steam in the June night air, and he hammered on the front door until Rowan came down the stairs with his boots half on and his coat thrown over one shoulder. Mara was right behind him. She slept light, always had, the kind of sleep that stayed close to the surface because the ranch never fully stopped demanding attention, even in the dark. Boyd's face in the lamplight was pale and set in the particular way of a man who has learned something he wishes he hadn't. "Aldous Pruitt had dinner in Callaway Bend last Tuesday," Boyd said, before either of them spoke. "At Denton's, private room. My foreman's brother tends bar there. He heard, not all of it, but enough." He stopped, looked at Mara directly. "They're coming for the ranch, not through courts, not through lawyers. They've hired men, outside men, not local. And there's talk of the herd and the water and—" He shook his head. "My foreman's brother isn't a reliable man in most respects, but he was scared when he told it, and scared men don't usually bother to invent things." Mara stood very still. "When?" He didn't know. Soon. That was the word. Soon. Rowan looked at Mara. She was in her work clothes. She'd apparently been up already or had dressed that fast. And her face was doing the thing it did when she was processing something at speed, running the variables, looking for the shape of a problem before committing to a response. "How many men?" Rowan asked Boyd. He heard 8. Maybe more. 8 hired men against 5 ranch hands, a woman, and a drifter who'd come in on a broke saddle 7 months ago. The arithmetic was not encouraging. "You didn't have to come out here," Mara said to Boyd. Boyd looked faintly uncomfortable, the way men look when they've done something decent and aren't quite sure how to wear it. "You sold me good stock and gave me a fair deal," he said. "That's more than most people did this year." He paused. "Also, if Pruitt burns your ranch and gets away with it, there's nothing stopping him from coming for mine next." "Practical of you," Mara said, and it wasn't a criticism. "I'm a practical man." He looked between them. "What do you need?" They talked until 4 in the morning, the 3 of them at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up high, and a pot of coffee that nobody was drinking because nobody had time for it. Rowan woke Dutch and Santos and had them sit in too, because what was being planned concerned them, and because he'd learned in the past 7 months that 5 people thinking about a problem found more of its edges than 2 people thinking about it alone. What they knew: hired men, coming soon, targeting the herd and the water supply. What they didn't know: exactly when, exactly how many, exactly which approach they'd use. What Mara knew, which she laid out on the table the way she laid out everything, in plain sequence without performance, was the geography of her own property in more precise detail than anyone in that room except Rowan. "They'll hit the north pasture first," she said. "That's where the largest concentration of the herd is, and it's the most accessible from the county road. If they want to stampede cattle, they come from the north." She turned the map she'd drawn toward Dutch. "The water supply said, the main creek intake is here. If they want to cut it or poison it, they need to be here, upstream of the intake gate." "So 2 teams," Dutch said. "One at the pasture, one at the water." "Maybe 3, Santos said quietly. Everyone looked at him. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it tended to be worth the wait. "If I'm Pruitt and I'm paying 8 men for one night's work, I want to be sure. I send 2 teams to do the damage and 1 team to make sure nobody goes for help." He looked at Rowan. "Block the road. Stop anyone riding to town or to neighbors." Rowan nodded slowly. "He's right." Boyd said, "I can have 4 of my men here by tomorrow evening." "That changes the count," Mara said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. 9 to 8, maybe. Better odds. But if they outnumber us at either point, we can't defend 2 locations and the road simultaneously, Rowan said. "Not with what we have. We'd be splitting ourselves thin." "So we don't defend," Mara said. The room went quiet. "We move the herd," she said. "Not all of it. We can't move all of it in time, but the breeding stock, the Hereford crosses, the animals with the real value, we move them before they come. If there's nothing in the north pasture worth stampeding, the damage they can do there is a fraction of what they're planning." "Move them where?" Dutch asked. "The mountain route," Rowan said. He'd ridden it twice. A high trail through the limestone breaks north of the ranch that came down on the far side into a box valley with natural water and grass. Remote, difficult to access quickly. "It's a full-day drive for the herd, but if we start tonight—" "In the dark," Pete said, with the tone of a man raising a concern he already knows won't change anything. "In the dark," Mara confirmed. "Santos, Caleb, Pete, you take the breeding stock up the mountain route. Start immediately after this meeting. Dutch." She looked at him. "I need you at the north pasture, not to fight, to observe. If they come, you fall back to the house. I need to know what they do and how many." "And the water intake?" Boyd asked. "I'll handle the water intake," Rowan said. Mara looked at him. "You said 9 to 8, he said. "Boyd's 4 men, plus us. That's enough for the road and the north pasture if Dutch has backup. The water intake is one man's job done right. Done right means I'm there before they are, and I know the terrain and they don't." He looked at her steadily. "I know that intake. I built the bypass on it." She held his gaze for a long moment. He could see her running the argument, looking for the flaw in it, because that was what she did. She checked everything, and not finding one she could act on. "All right," she said. "Boyd, you're 4 men. Can they be here by 8 tomorrow evening?" "7, if I push it," Boyd said. "7. We position by 9. If nothing happens by midnight, we reassess." She stood up. "Pete, Santos, Caleb, go get the horses. We start moving the breeding stock in an hour." The hour it took to cut the breeding stock from the main herd and start them toward the mountain trail was not a clean hour. Cattle in the dark are a specific kind of difficult. They can sense something wrong in human behavior before humans can articulate it, and they respond to that sensing by becoming uncooperative in all the ways that cows can be uncooperative, which are numerous. 3 animals broke from the group twice. One of Boyd's men, who'd come ahead of the others, took a horn to the thigh that left him limping but functional. Santos worked the left flank in near total silence, moving his horse with a precision that Rowan, watching from the gate, found quietly extraordinary. By 2:30 in the morning, the breeding stock were on the trail. Rowan watched them go. Pete on point, Santos on the left, Caleb riding drag, moving up into the black of the limestone breaks until the sounds of their passage faded and the night closed over them. Then he went to the water intake. The intake sat on the northern bank of the creek, where the main channel split and the ranch's irrigation system began. He knew it the way he knew things he'd built himself. Not by memory exactly, but by something more physical, a sense of the dimensions and angles of it that lived in his hands more than his head. He positioned himself on the high bank upstream, in the scrub cedar where the shadows were thickest, with a clear line of sight to the gate mechanism and the approach trail from the county road. He settled in and waited, which was something he was better at than he usually got credit for. They came at midnight, which was earlier than he'd expected and later than he'd feared. He heard them before he saw them, the particular sound of men moving at night who are trying to be quiet but aren't quite quiet enough, boots on creek gravel, the muffled clank of something metal carried in a sack. 3 men, as it turned out. Santos had been right about the 3-team configuration. The lead man reached the intake gate and crouched over it, and Rowan watched him pull a wrench in what looked like a glass bottle from the sack, the wrench for the gate mechanism, the bottle for something that went in the water which Rowan didn't intend to find out about directly. He stood up from the cedar shadow and said, "That'd be a mistake." The 3 men went very still. "I'm going to tell you something honestly," Rowan said. "I've been sitting here for 3 hours. I'm cold and I'm tired and I have less patience than usual. You came here to do a job for Aldous Pruitt, and I'm telling you that the job isn't going to get done tonight. The question you need to answer is whether you want to have a longer conversation about it or a shorter one." There was a silence. The lead man was looking at him, trying to read the darkness, trying to assess what was behind the voice. "How many of you?" the lead man said. "Enough," Rowan said, which was both true and not true in ways he didn't elaborate on. "You're 3 men being paid to poison a water supply. That's not a hanging offense if you walk away from it right now. It is one if you don't." Another silence. Longer this time. The lead man stood up slowly. He looked at the other 2. Something passed between them that wasn't quite words. "We were never here," the lead man said. "No," Rowan agreed. "You weren't." They left. He listened to the sound of them going, retreating up the approach trail, moving faster than they'd come, until the creek noise covered it entirely. He let out a breath that he'd been holding longer than he'd realized, and sat back down on the bank because his legs had made that decision for him, and looked at the water moving in the dark. At the north pasture, it did not go as cleanly. He learned this when he came back to the ranch house at 2 in the morning and found Dutch sitting on the porch steps with a rag wrapped around his left forearm, and Boyd's man, the one who'd taken the horn to the thigh, standing in the yard with a rifle across his arms watching the north approach. "How bad?" Rowan said, looking at the arm. "Graze," Dutch said. "Somebody had a firearm and less patience than the rest of them." He shifted the rag. "There were 7 of them. They hit the north pasture from the road, like Mara said they would. When they found the main herd instead of the breeding stock, He paused. "They did damage. Fired shots to scatter the animals. Got maybe 200 head running." Rowan's jaw tightened. How far? Southeast mostly. Boyd's other 3 men went after them. Dutch looked up. They also set fire to the east section of the north pasture. Grass fire. We got it contained, but there's maybe 40 acres burned. 40 acres of grass. Not catastrophic. Not with the northwest pasture online, but not nothing either. And 200 head running loose in the dark was a day's work to recover, minimum. Did any of them stay? Rowan asked. After the scatter? 2 did. Boyd's man put one on the ground. Not killed, just down. The other one ran when things went sideways. Dutch looked at him steadily. The one on the ground is in the barn. He's conscious. Rowan went to the barn. The man on the ground was maybe 30, lean and weathered, with the look of someone who'd been doing this kind of work long enough that it no longer surprised him when it went wrong. He had a cut above his eye from where he'd hit the ground, and his left ankle was swelling inside his boot, but he was alert. He looked at Rowan when Rowan crouched in front of him. "You want to tell me who hired you?" Rowan said. Not a question. The man said nothing. "I'm going to ask you to think about your situation," Rowan said. "You came to do a job on a private ranch. That's criminal trespass with intent to cause property damage, which in Texas is a felony. The man you work for is insulated from that. He's Aldous Pruitt. He has lawyers. He was probably having supper in Callaway Bend tonight with 3 witnesses." Rowan looked at him. "You, on the other hand, are in a barn with a busted ankle. When the sheriff comes out here tomorrow, and he's coming, we're sending for him tonight. You're going to be the one sitting in a cell." The man's eyes moved, just slightly. "Unless," Rowan said, "you have something useful to say. Because what Pruitt did tonight is more than property damage. He coordinated an attack on a legally operating ranch using hired men. That's conspiracy, and it's a different category of charge." He held the man's gaze. "Your name on a sworn statement changes your position considerably." A long silence. The barn settled around them. The warm smell of hay and horses. The sound of the night wind outside. "I don't know his name," the man said finally. "Didn't deal with him direct. Dealt with his nephew. Cecil." The man said nothing, which was confirmation enough. "Cecil Pruitt hired you," Rowan said. "Hired all of you." Another silence, then paid half up front, half on completion. A pause. "There's not going to be a completion." "No," Rowan said. "There isn't." Mara was in the north pasture when he found her, standing at the edge of the burned section as the first gray light of dawn came up over the limestone breaks, looking at 40 acres of blackened grass with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. She'd been there for a while, he could tell. The dew had settled on her shoulders. He stood beside her and looked at the burned ground. "The breeding stock?" she said. "On the mountain. Santos checked in an hour ago. They made the box valley. Everyone's fine." She nodded. "The man in the barn." "Says Cecil Pruitt hired them. Paid half up front." She was quiet for a long moment. "Will he say that to a judge?" "He will if Harvey gives him the right kind of deal. He's scared and he's hurt, and he's got nothing to protect Pruitt for." She looked at the burned ground. He watched the line of her jaw, the way she held herself, upright but not rigid, the way a structure holds itself when it's been tested and has found out what it's made of. 40 acres, she said. The northwest pasture covers it. We're not short on grass." "I know." She was quiet again. "It's not the grass." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were tired, genuinely tired, the kind that goes deeper than one missed night's sleep. "They came here. They came to my property in the middle of the night with guns and fire and—" She stopped. Not because she was losing composure, but because she was being precise with what she said, the way she was always precise. "I knew it was coming. I planned for it. And it still—" She paused. "It still makes something very cold in my chest." He didn't say it would be all right, because he didn't know that it would, and she'd have seen through it anyway. He said, "We held it." She looked at him. "They came with 7 men and fire, and they didn't get what they came for," he said. "The breeding stock is safe. The water's clean. The man in the barn is going to testify. And Pruitt spent a significant amount of money last night to accomplish 40 acres of burned grass and a busted ankle employee who's about to give him up. He looked at her steadily. We held it, Mara. She absorbed that. The dawn light was coming up fully now, turning the burned ground from black to a dull, scorched brown. Ugly, but finite. Not the whole ranch. Just 40 acres. Boyd's men, she said. I need to thank them properly. Boyd will be here by 9. She nodded. Looked once more at the burned ground. Then she turned away from it. Not as a defeat, but as a decision. A deliberate choice about where to point herself. And walked back toward the house with the particular stride she always had, measured and solid, like someone who has decided what direction to move in and sees no reason to second-guess it. Rowan looked at the burned ground for another moment after she'd gone. 40 acres. Not nothing, but not enough. Not nearly enough to be what Pruitt had intended. He turned and followed her. Quad. Harvey Dodd came out that afternoon and spent 4 hours in the barn with the injured man, whose name turned out to be Hector Briggs, originally from Louisiana, career of irregular employment, and came out with 12 pages of handwritten notes and an expression that was as close to animated as Harvey Dodd's face generally got. He'll testify, Harvey said, at the kitchen table, to Mara and Rowan and Boyd Sumter, who had arrived at 9 as promised and hadn't left. He's already given me names, Was. 5 of the 7 men who were here last night, including 2 who have prior charges in other counties. More importantly, he's given me a chain. Harvey set down his notes and looked at them. Cecil Pruitt met with Briggs and the man who organized the group, a man named Tolliver out of Laredo, at a hotel in Sackett's Well 3 weeks ago. Briggs was present for that meeting. He heard Cecil authorize the full operation, not vaguely, specifically, targets, methods, payment structure. A silence settled over the table. That's conspiracy, Mara said. That's conspiracy, Harvey confirmed. Against Cecil, certainly. Against Aldous, he hesitated. Aldous is more insulated. But if Cecil gave Tolliver instructions that originated with his uncle, and we can establish that chain, Tolliver, Rowan said. Where is he now? That I don't know. He wasn't here last night. Briggs says he organized, but didn't participate directly. He'll run, Boyd said. When word gets out that Briggs talked. Word hasn't gotten out yet, Mara said. She was looking at Harvey. How quickly can you file? I can file the criminal complaint tomorrow morning, Harvey said. If I file before Pruitt knows Briggs is talking, there's a chance the circuit court issues a hold that prevents. File tomorrow, Mara said. First thing. Harvey nodded. There's one more thing. He sorted through his notes. Briggs mentioned something in passing, said Cecil told Tolliver the operation needed to happen before the end of June because of something changing in July. He didn't know what, but Cecil was specific about the timing. Mara was very still. The supply contracts renew in July, she said. The San Antonio agreements. They're up for renewal on the 15th. If the ranch is in crisis, Rowan said slowly, if there's visible damage, instability, Fourier and the other agents might walk away from the renewal, Mara finished, or renegotiate at lower terms. She looked at the table for a moment. It wasn't just about the herd or the water. It was about making the ranch look vulnerable before the contracts came up. The room was quiet. Boyd let out a slow breath. Man thinks 3 moves ahead. He does, Mara said. He just doesn't account for the people in the middle of the board thinking too. She looked at Harvey. File tomorrow, and write to Fourier tonight. I'll tell him what happened and that the operation is stable. He deserves to hear it from me before he hears rumors. Harvey gathered his notes. You should know, he said, that even with Briggs's testimony, this is going to be a difficult case. The Pruitt name carries weight in this state. Their lawyers are good. It will take time. I know, Mara said. And Aldous Pruitt is going to be very angry. I know that too. She looked at Harvey directly. File the complaint. He left. Boyd left shortly after, with the agreement that his men would ride the Ashcroft perimeter for the next 2 weeks as a precaution. Dutch and Santos went to start the work of tracking and recovering the scattered cattle. Pete Lyle rode out to the mountain trail to check on the breeding stock and send word of what had happened. The house went quiet. Mara sat at the kitchen table with the lamp lit even though it was still afternoon, because the sky had clouded over and the light was low, and she opened the ledger and began adding the night's events to the documentation record, dates, descriptions, witnesses, evidence, all of it in the neat, precise hand that had been building this record for 11 months. Rowan made coffee, set a cup beside her without being asked, the way he'd been doing since October. She didn't look up, but her hand moved slightly toward it. He sat down across from her and watched her write, and thought about the chain of things that had brought them to this particular table in this particular light. The $11, the broken saddle, the 11-minute ceremony in a courthouse anteroom, the east fence he'd fixed without telling her, and how none of it had gone the way either of them planned, which was the one thing they'd had in common from the beginning. "Rowan," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "Yeah. Thank you." A pause. "For the water intake, for—" She stopped, and he understood that she was having the same difficulty she always had with gratitude. The way it required her to acknowledge a need she'd spent years learning to carry without acknowledgement. "For being there last night." "There's nowhere else I would have been," he said. She looked up at that, but her eyes were tired and the lamp made them look darker than they were. And she looked at him for a long moment with the full attention she usually reserved for problems that required solving. Then she went back to the ledger. But something in the room had shifted, something that had been building through 11 months of fence lines and irrigation channels and burned grass and late-night tables, and two people learning the shape of each other's particular kinds of stubbornness. And both of them felt it, and neither of them said anything more about it, because some things don't need saying to be true. Outside, the clouds moved over Callaway Bend, and somewhere in the county seat, Harvey Dodd was already drafting the complaint that would put the name Cecil Pruitt in a court record, and the scattered cattle were beginning to be found and turned back toward home, and on a mountain trail through the limestone breaks, the breeding stock, the real heart of everything they'd built, grazed in a box valley and waited for morning. Harvey filed the criminal complaint on a Wednesday morning, and by Thursday afternoon the news had moved through Callaway Bend the way news moves in small towns. Not through any single channel, but through all of them simultaneously, the way water finds every crack in a foundation at once. The barbershop knew by noon. The dry goods store knew by 2. By the time the evening crowd gathered at Denton's saloon, there wasn't a man in the room who hadn't heard that Cecil Pruitt had been named in a criminal conspiracy complaint filed by the Ashcroft Ranch, supported by the sworn testimony of a participant who had been present for the planning meeting in Sackett's Well. Cecil's response was immediate and expensive. 2 lawyers from San Antonio arrived in Callaway Bend by the following Monday, checked into the hotel, and began the work of constructing a defense that rested primarily on the argument that Hector Briggs was an unreliable witness with a history of criminal employment and a personal motive to reduce his own exposure by implicating others. This was not an inaccurate description of Briggs, which was the problem. It was accurate as far as it went. And in a courthouse where the Pruitt name had weight, accurate could be made to go quite far. Harvey was not surprised. He'd expected it, told Mara as much when he came out to the ranch the following week with an update that was honest about the difficulties ahead. "They're going to drag this," Harvey said. "Every procedural motion available, every delay. Their goal is to exhaust us financially before it reaches a jury." "How long?" Mara asked. "If they work every angle, a year, maybe longer." Rowan watched Mara's face process this. She was at the kitchen table, hands flat on the surface in front of her, and she looked like someone who has just been told that the road is longer than the map suggested and is deciding whether that changes anything about the destination. "What do we need to strengthen the case?" she said. Harvey set down his notes. "Tolliver, the man who organized the group. If we find Tolliver and he corroborates Briggs's account, it's no longer one witness against a well-funded denial. It's 2 independent accounts of the same meeting." "Where is he?" "Last known location was Laredo. He left 2 days after the raid. Someone warned him, most likely. Texas Rangers have a notice on him, but Laredo's a porous border town, and notices don't always—" Harvey paused diplomatically. "They don't always produce results quickly. So we wait on Tolliver," Rowan said. "We wait on Tolliver," Harvey confirmed. "In the meantime, we keep documenting. We keep the ranch operating visibly and stably, and we don't give Pruitt's lawyers anything to work with." He looked at Mara. "That means no public statements, no confrontations, Nothing that can be characterized as aggressive behavior from your side. We've never been the aggressive side, Mara said, with a flatness that wasn't quite bitterness, but had visited the neighborhood. I know that, Harvey said. I'm asking you to make sure everyone else knows it too. July arrived and with it the contract renewals, and this was where the night of burned grass and scattered cattle failed entirely to accomplish what Pruitt had intended. Mara had written to Fourier the night of the raid, as she'd said she would, a direct, detailed letter that described what had happened, what the ranch had done to protect the breeding stock, and what the current operational status was. She included the survey numbers from the Northwest pasture, the head count from the Box Valley recovery, and the criminal complaint filing date. Fourier replied within a week. The renewal came in at terms better than the previous year. The second agent, a man named Ashby, who ran contracts for 3 distributors in the Hill Country, took a little longer because Ashby was cautious by nature and had heard things about the Ashcroft situation that required discussion. He came out to the ranch in person in mid-July, which Mara had expected and prepared for. She walked him through the entire operation. Not the parts that looked good, all of it. The burned 40 acres in the North pasture, which were already beginning to show new growth because grass in South Texas, given any moisture at all, is stubborn about surviving. The documentation record, which she let him read in full. The breeding stock that had spent 3 nights on a mountain trail and come back in better condition than they'd left, because the Box Valley had good water and nobody had bothered them. Ashby was a quiet man who listened more than he talked, and he listened to all of it, and then he said, "The complaint against Cecil Pruitt, you're confident it holds?" "I'm confident the facts hold," Mara said. "Courts take their own time." Pruitt's been trying to acquire your water rights for 3 years, Ashby said. He wasn't asking. He'd done his own research before coming out. Everything he's tried has failed. Yes. Ashby looked at the northwest pasture, which was visible through the window, green and full in the July light. Why haven't you considered selling, not to Pruitt, but the water rights specifically, to the County Water Authority? You'd get a fair price and remove the primary motive for his interference. It was a reasonable question, and Mara gave it the consideration a reasonable question deserved. Because, she said, the water rights are what makes this land what it is. Without them, I have grazing acreage in a drought county. With them, I have a productive ranch that can grow and supply and employ people for the next 50 years. She held Ashby's gaze. I didn't build this operation to sell the thing that makes it work because someone powerful wants it badly enough to commit crimes. Ashby was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, in the way a man nods when he's made up his mind. The second contract renewed the following week at the same terms as before. Rowan found out about Ashby's visit and the renewal when Mara told him at supper, the same way she told him most things. Directly, without build-up, the information presented as information. Both contracts held, she said. Good, he said. She looked at him across the table. Ashby asked me why I hadn't sold the water rights. What'd you tell him? She repeated it, the same word she'd used with Ashby, and Rowan listened and nodded slowly. That's the right answer, he said. I know it is. She picked up her fork. I just wanted to say it out loud again. He looked at her. There was something in her face that wasn't quite vulnerability. Mara's face rarely permitted full vulnerability. It was too practiced in its composure, but was adjacent to it. Something that said, I've been carrying this a long time, and sometimes saying the right thing out loud is how I remember it's still true. It's still true, he said, as though she'd said it aloud. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted. That small, controlled shift he'd been learning to read for months now. The one that meant something had landed. Then she went back to eating. The summer moved through its long, hot weeks with the particular pace of South Texas in drought years, slow during the day, when the heat pressed everything flat, and surprisingly busy in the mornings and evenings when the temperature allowed actual movement. The scattered cattle had all been recovered within a week of the raid. Dutch and Santos had done the work methodically, finding animals as far as 4 miles from the ranch and turning them back without losing a single head to injury or snakebite, which Santos pointed out was a better outcome than the math suggested they deserved. The burned 40 acres began coming back in late July. Not fully, that would take another season, but enough to graze lightly, enough to show that the land wasn't permanently damaged. Rowan walked it one morning and found new grass already knee-high in the low areas where the soil held moisture, and stood there for a while just looking at it, thinking about the specific stubbornness of growing things. What changed in August was not something that happened on the ranch. It happened in Callaway Bend, in the courthouse, in Harvey Dodd's office, and, most significantly, in the social mathematics of a frontier town that had been watching to see which way a particular calculation resolved. The calculation resolved on a Tuesday in August when the circuit court issued a preliminary ruling that Hector Briggs's testimony was admissible and that the criminal complaint against Cecil Pruitt would proceed to a formal hearing. Pruitt's San Antonio lawyers filed 2 immediate motions challenging the ruling. The court denied both within a week. That denial was the moment the calculation resolved, because the people of Callaway Bend, the merchants, the ranchers, the ordinary working people who had no particular stake in the Pruitt business empire, except that it had been the dominant weight in their county for 20 years. Those people had been watching the Ashcroft situation the way you watch a storm develop, trying to judge whether it was going to pass or was going to land. The water rights case, the criminal complaint, the raid that hadn't accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish, and now a court that had denied 2 Pruitt motions in a row. The storm, it appeared, was landing on Pruitt. Boyd Sumter came out to the ranch on a Saturday in late August with a bottle of decent whiskey and the news that 3 of Aldous Pruitt's longest-standing business partners in Callaway Bend had quietly begun distancing themselves from Pruitt Consolidated Operations. "Hendricks at the bank," Boyd said, sitting on the porch with Rowan while the evening came on. "He's been the Pruitt account manager for 15 years. Word is he's been talking to the county water authority independently, not through Pruitt." Boyd poured 2 glasses and set the bottle down on the rail. "And the Garfield brothers. You know them. They've been buying feed through Pruitt's distributor. They came to see Mara last week." "I know," Rowan said. "I was in the barn." Boyd looked at him. "And?" "And she told them the same thing she tells everyone. Here's what we're doing, here's what it costs, here's what the results have been. Take it or leave it." "They're taking it," Boyd said. "I know." Boyd sipped his whiskey and was quiet for a moment, looking out at the pasture where the herd was coming in for the evening. More animals than there had been a year ago, better conditioned, the Hereford crosses moving with the particular easy authority of cattle that have been well managed through difficult conditions. "You know what people are saying in town?" Boyd said. "Probably several things," Rowan said. "About Mara specifically." Boyd turned the glass in his hand. "They're saying she was right, not—" He paused, searching for precision. "Not just that she survived or that the ranch made it. They're saying she was right about the land, right about the water, right about what this operation could be. People who spent 3 years finding her a subject of entertainment are now finding her a subject of a different kind of attention." Rowan said nothing. He was looking at the herd. "Does she know?" Boyd asked. "She knows," Rowan said. "She's not sure what to do with it." "What do you mean?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. "She spent 3 years being told she was wrong about everything. The ranch, the irrigation, the breeding decisions, all of it. And she kept doing it anyway because she could read a ledger and run the numbers, and the numbers said she was right, even when everyone around her said she wasn't." He paused. "Now the numbers have been proved out, and the people who said she was wrong want to do business with her. And she'll do business with them because she's practical. But it doesn't give back the 3 years." Boyd considered this. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a while in the way men sit with things that don't have resolutions, just acknowledgments. "She's lucky to have you," Boyd said finally. Rowan looked at him sideways. "Other way around," he said. Boyd smiled into his glass and didn't push it. The Garfield brothers, Garfield Sr. and Tom, as it turned out, not the siblings Rowan had initially assumed, became the first of what would grow into a formal arrangement that Mara drew up in September with Harvey's help. A supply and resource-sharing cooperative that allowed smaller ranching operations in the county to access Ashcroft's water infrastructure, breeding stock, and supply contracts in exchange for coordinated labor during peak seasons and a percentage of the improved productivity. It was not a charity. Mara was precise about that in every conversation she had about it, with the directness she brought to everything. "I'm not doing this to help anyone," she told Tom Garfield at the kitchen table, when he'd started to frame the arrangement in terms that suggested generosity on her part. "I'm doing this because a region of productive ranches is worth more to my operation than a region of struggling ones. Healthy neighbors mean stable supply routes, maintained infrastructure, and a market that can actually absorb what I produce. This is self-interest." Tom Garfield, a straightforward man in his 50s who had spent 20 years in Pruitt's economic orbit and was finding the adjustment to a different kind of business relationship somewhat disorienting, looked at her for a moment and then said, "Ma'am, with respect, I've been doing business in this county for a long time, and self-interest that also happens to benefit everyone involved is considerably rarer than you're making it sound." Mara looked at him. "Then we've both been in business with the wrong people," she said. Tom laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of him. And that was how the cooperative was founded. Rowan sat in on that meeting and 3 others like it through September and October, sometimes contributing and sometimes just listening, learning the specific way Mara conducted business, the way you learn the grammar of a language you've been speaking phonetically, suddenly understanding the rules that had been operating underneath what you already knew. She never overpromised. She never understated difficulty. She gave people information and let them make decisions, which meant the decisions they made tended to stick because they'd made them with full knowledge rather than comfortable illusions. And she never, in any of those meetings, mentioned what it had cost to build what she was offering them access to. Not the years of insults, not the pamphlets burned in the kitchen stove, not the night on the mountain trail, not the 40 acres of burned grass. She presented the operation as it currently was, productive, stable, well-documented, and let the past be the past. Rowan mentioned this to her one evening in October when the cooperative had its 3rd new member and the ledger was showing numbers that were the best they'd been in the 3 years since Thomas Ashcroft had died and left his daughter a drought-stricken ranch and a deed clause that might have ended everything. "You never tell them what it took," he said. She was at the stove, not the table for once, making actual food, a beef stew that had been going since morning and smelled like something that intended to be good. She stirred it without turning around. "Why would I?" she said. "People respect difficulty, knowing what you went through to get here." "I don't want their respect for what I went through," she said. "I want their respect for what I built." She turned around then, ladle in hand, and looked at him with the directness that was so fundamental to her that it sometimes still caught him off guard. "Telling people about your suffering is asking them to value you for what happened to you. I'd rather be valued for what I did about it." He looked at her. Across the kitchen that he'd eaten 1,000 meals in by now, across the table covered in ledger books and survey maps and cooperative agreements, across the year and a half that had turned $11 and a broke saddle into whatever this was. "That's the most you think you've ever said," he told her. She turned back to the stove. "Supper's in 20 minutes." Cecil Pruitt's formal hearing was set for November. Harvey spent October preparing, and Hector Briggs spent October under a loose protective arrangement, not imprisonment, just a strong suggestion from the circuit court that he remain available and accessible in a boarding house in the county seat. Tolliver had not been found, which remained the weak point in the case, but Harvey had spent the summer quietly locating and deposing 3 other men who had been present on the night of the raid, 2 of whom were willing to provide statements in exchange for reduced charges. The picture that emerged from those statements was detailed and damning. The planning meeting in Sackett's Well, Cecil's specific instructions about the timing, before the July contract renewals, the payment structure, the targets. All of it consistent with Briggs's account, corroborated now by men who hadn't spoken to each other since the night of the raid. Aldous Pruitt, Rowan noticed, had become very quiet. The formal posturing, the public contempt, the long tradition of Pruitt Consolidated making itself felt in every corner of Callaway Bend commerce, all of it had receded over the summer into something more careful and contained. The San Antonio lawyers were still in town, still filing motions, but the motions had become defensive rather than aggressive, building walls rather than launching attacks. The financial picture of Pruitt Consolidated, as it filtered through Boyd's connections and Harvey's sources and the general information ecology of a small county, was not healthy. Two of the major land acquisitions that had been in progress when the court cases started had stalled because the financing had been contingent on the Ashcroft water rights being secured. Without those rights, the development plans that Aldous Pruitt had been constructing for 3 years were not viable in their current form. He had spent a great deal of money on lawyers, on hired men, on the mechanisms of pressure and harassment, trying to take something that had not been taken. And the something in question was still standing, and now had a cooperative of 8 ranching operations associated with it, and contracts that had renewed at improved terms, and a criminal complaint that was 2 months from a hearing. It was Boyd who told Rowan what Aldous Pruitt had said at a dinner in Callaway Bend in late October. Not a private dinner this time, but a public one, a civic occasion of some kind where Pruitt had apparently said, to the room in general and to no one in particular, that the Ashcroft woman had proved him wrong, and he was man enough to say so. Rowan received this information with some skepticism. "That sounds like a man managing his reputation," he said. "Probably," Boyd agreed. "Doesn't make it less true." Rowan thought about that. "Did he say anything about the lawsuit?" "He said his lawyers were reviewing their position." Boyd paused. "In my experience, when a man's lawyers review their position, it means the man is reviewing his." 2 weeks later, Harvey Dodd received a communication from Pruitt's San Antonio attorneys indicating that their client was prepared to discuss a settlement of the criminal complaint and all related civil matters, subject to terms to be negotiated. Harvey brought the letter to the ranch on a Friday afternoon and put it on the kitchen table. Mara read it. Rowan read it. Harvey sat across from them with the expression of a man who has more to say and is waiting for the right moment to say it. "Tell me the terms," Mara said. "They haven't specified terms yet. This is an opening. They're asking if you're willing to discuss." Harvey folded his hands. "My advice, and it is only advice, is that you consider it seriously. A negotiated settlement gets you certainty. A trial gets you the possibility of more, and the possibility of significantly less, over a timeline that will cost you another year of legal fees and energy." "What do we get in a settlement?" Rowan asked. "That's negotiable. At minimum, full cessation of any claim to the Ashcroft water rights, payment of documented damages from the raid and the harassment campaign, and Cecil Pruitt's formal withdrawal from any business activity in this county for a period to be determined." Harvey paused. "And a formal acknowledgement of liability, which becomes part of the public record." Mara was quiet for a long time, long enough that Harvey shifted slightly in his chair. "The acknowledgement," she said finally. "It goes in the public record." "Yes. Not a private settlement, not a sealed agreement." "That would be our position," Harvey said carefully. "They may push back on it." "Then they push back," Mara said. "The acknowledgement is not negotiable." Harvey nodded slowly. "All right. And the damages figure, I want it to cover the full 11 months of documented incidents, not just the raid, every cut fence, every pulled stake, every anonymous letter to the supply agents." She looked at Harvey directly. "We documented all of it. I want it counted." "That's a substantial figure," Harvey said. "It's a truthful one," she said. Harvey picked up his pen and began making notes. Rowan watched Mara across the table. The set of her shoulders, the particular quality of her focus, the way she was approaching this the same way she approached everything, not as a victory to be celebrated, but as a problem to be resolved correctly. "Mara," Rowan said. She looked at him. "The acknowledgement, that was the right call." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to hear it from someone else." He almost smiled. That, he thought, was as close to vulnerable as Mara Ashcroft got, and it was more than most people ever saw. The settlement negotiations took 3 weeks. Harvey was meticulous, and Pruitt's lawyers were experienced, and the process was exactly as uncomfortable as 3 weeks of 2 sets of lawyers arguing over the precise language of liability acknowledgments tends to be. Mara reviewed every draft. She sent back 3 versions with handwritten corrections and a note to Harvey, each time that said, essentially, "This language obscures more than it reveals. Try again." The final agreement was signed on a cold morning in November, 1 week before the hearing would have begun. Cecil Pruitt's name appeared in a public court record as having authorized and financed a coordinated campaign of property damage and harassment against the Ashcroft Ranch, and as having organized the raid of June 14th with the specific intent to damage property and destabilize commercial contracts. The damages figure was substantial. The prohibition on Pruitt business activity in the county ran for 5 years. Aldous Pruitt's name was not in the criminal record. This was the limitation of what the evidence could prove, and Mara had accepted it because Harvey had told her clearly that pushing further would likely produce nothing and could unravel what they had. She accepted it without visible disappointment, which Rowan thought was one of the more impressive things he'd seen her do, because he knew what it cost. On the day the agreement was signed, Harvey sent a messenger to the ranch with a copy. Pete Lyle brought it to Mara in the south pasture, where she was checking the fence line she'd been checking when Rowan first rode up a year and a half ago. She read it standing in the field with her work gloves in her back pocket, and then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and went back to checking the fence. When Rowan found her 20 minutes later, she was at the corner post, running the wire with her hands the same way she'd been running it when he first saw her. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He stood beside her. The November air was cold and clean, and the cattle in the south pasture were moving the slow, purposeful way cattle move when they're well fed and the weather is cool enough to make movement feel worthwhile. The fence line ran straight and solid to the horizon, repaired section by repaired section over 18 months, until it was something different from what it had been. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him. "About what?" "The rest of it." He paused. "The agreement covers the legal side. Doesn't cover, He stopped, finding that what he meant was not easily contained in the sentence he'd started. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw in her face the thing he'd been watching develop over 18 months. The careful, measuring attention that had always been there, but warmer now, less defended, the way a place becomes warmer when you've spent enough time in it. "There's a cooperative meeting next week," she said. "Boyd's bringing 2 new families who want to join. The Northwest pasture needs its winter drainage check. The breeding contracts for spring need to be drafted." She paused. "And the east boundary fence, the section on your 40 acres, needs 2 new posts before the ground freezes." "I know," he said. "I was going to do it this weekend." "I know you were," she said. They stood at the corner post of the south pasture in the cold November light, on land that had been fought for in every possible way that land can be fought for, legally, financially, physically, and in the daily grinding accumulation of work done right over time. Not perfect land. Not easy land. Land with burned patches and repaired wire, and irrigation channels that had needed correcting, and a ledger full of documented difficulties that had each been absorbed and answered. His land too now, in a way that the deed for 40 acres on the east boundary only partially captured. She didn't say that. Neither did he. Some things don't require saying because the ground itself says them, if you've built something on it together and it's still standing. Mara turned and walked back toward the house, and Rowan fell in beside her, and the south pasture held them both in its long afternoon shadow, and the ranch, imperfect, stubborn, still growing, went on around them the way it always had. The winter that followed the settlement was the quietest the Ashcroft Ranch had known in years. And quiet, Rowan discovered, was something you had to learn how to inhabit after a long time of not having it. He fixed the east boundary fence that weekend, as he'd said he would. 2 new posts, 60 feet of wire, a corner brace that had been leaning since October. He worked alone in the cold morning air, and the work had the particular quality of work that nobody was trying to stop. Clean and uncomplicated, each thing going where it was supposed to go. When he finished, he stood at the corner of his 40 acres and looked at it, and thought that it was a strange thing, how a piece of ground could feel different once you'd earned it rather than been given it. He'd been given the 40 acres on the first day. He'd earned them every day after. The cooperative meeting that Boyd had mentioned brought 11 people to the ranch on a Saturday in late November. The Garfield brothers, Clara Hess, 2 new families named Whitfield and Bauer, who'd been struggling through the drought on the county's eastern edge, Boyd himself, and a handful of others who had heard about the arrangement and asked to come. Mara had set up the kitchen and the front room both, because 11 people didn't fit around one table, and she'd made coffee and put out food not as a performance of hospitality, but because it was cold, and people had ridden a long way. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Mara ran it the way she ran everything, with information at the center of it, practical and specific, no speeches and no sentiment. She presented the cooperative's first quarter results, the shared supply contract terms for the coming year, the breeding schedule that would allow members to access Ashcroft stock at cost. She answered questions directly. When she didn't know something, she said so, which in Rowan's experience was rarer in a room full of business arrangements than it should have been. Near the end, Clara Hess, a small, weathered woman in her 60s who had spent years being overlooked in exactly the meetings she needed to be heard in, said something that stopped the room. "I want to say something that isn't about business," Clara said, in the careful way of a person who has thought about whether to speak and has decided to. Mara looked at her. 3 years ago, when my husband died and I was trying to figure out whether to sell the operation or keep it going, I asked 4 different people in this county for advice. Clara's hands were folded on the table in front of her. None of them were you. I didn't ask you because... She paused, and her honesty in that pause was complete. Because I'd heard the way people talked about you, and I let that shape what I thought you were. She met Mara's eyes. That was a mistake I made, and I want to say it plainly. The room was quiet, not uncomfortably, just the way a room gets quiet when something true has been said in it. Mara looked at Clara for a moment. Her expression was not the expression of someone receiving an apology gracefully, performing forgiveness for the room. It was more complicated than that, something that acknowledged the cost of what Clara was describing, both the mistake and the saying of it. "You're here now," Mara said. "I am," Clara said. "Then that's what matters," Mara said, and moved to the next item on the agenda. Rowan, sitting against the wall where he'd positioned himself to stay out of the way, thought that was probably the most honest thing he'd heard in a room full of people trying to be decent, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than people admit. Spring came in with rain for the first time in 3 years, real rain that lasted 4 days and turned the creek from a cautious trickle into something with actual authority, and the Ashcroft irrigation channels, both phases, all 6 lines, filled and ran the way they'd been designed to run, which was the first time Mara had seen them operating at full capacity since she'd started building them. She stood at the main intake on the second day of rain and watched the water move, and Rowan stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there wasn't anything to say that the water wasn't already saying better. "The Northwest pasture is going to be full coverage by June," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting 2 years to see that. What does it look like in your head when you planned it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Green," she said. "Wall to wall. Enough grass to run 120 head through summer without supplemental feed." She paused. "Everybody thought the irrigation was too ambitious, too expensive for the potential return. The numbers said otherwise. The numbers always said otherwise," she said. "The problem was getting anyone to look at the numbers instead of at me." He looked at her profile, the rain making everything close and gray around them, the water running strong in the channel, the ranch spread out behind them in the wet morning. He'd been looking at her for a year and a half, and he still found himself noticing things, which he'd come to understand was not going to stop. "Mara," he said. She turned. There were things he'd been carrying for months that he hadn't found the right shape for, not because the feelings were unclear, but because he'd spent enough of his life moving from place to place that the language of staying had gotten rusty. He knew how to arrive. He hadn't known, until recently, how to mean it. "The year's been up for 5 months," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know. I haven't left. I noticed. I'm not going to," he said. "I want you to know that's a decision, not just circumstances. Not because of the 40 acres or the agreement or anything that was on paper." He held her gaze. "I'm staying because this is where I want to be, because of what you've built here and what you are, and because somewhere between the east fence and the water intake I stopped being able to imagine being anywhere else." The rain came down around them. The creek ran full. Somewhere in the north pasture, one of the cows made the loud, indignant sound that cows make when rain inconveniences them, which it almost always does. Mara's expression did something he'd only seen it do a handful of times. It opened, just slightly, the careful composure giving way to something underneath that had been waiting a long time for the right conditions. "I know you're not Gerald's act of desperation anymore," she said. "I figured that out around October." A pause. "Of last year." "Just took you that long?" "I wanted to be sure," she said. "I'm careful with things I don't want to be wrong about." He looked at her. And I'm sure," she said, with the same plainness she brought to everything. The ledger figures, the supply contracts, the fence line measurements, and it was the most direct declaration he'd ever received, and also the most like her, which made it the most meaningful. The rain kept falling. They stood at the water intake of an irrigation system that had taken 2 years and most of their combined resources to build, on land that 4 different legal mechanisms had tried to take away, and the water ran through the channels the way it was supposed to, and that was enough. The years that followed did not resolve into ease. That's the thing about building something real. It doesn't become easy. It becomes familiar, which is different. There were drought years and wet years, years when the cattle market dropped, and years when it climbed, a bad winter in '87 that killed 40 head and set the breeding program back 6 months, and a legal dispute with a neighboring property over an access road that took 2 years to resolve and cost more in Harvey's fees than either party had originally wanted to spend. Rowan's wanted notice, the 1-2 counties back that he'd been not quite running from when he'd ridden into Callaway Bend, was resolved in 1886, when Harvey, who had been quietly working on it for a year at Rowan's request, established that the underlying charge had been based on a false complaint filed by a man who had since been convicted of fraud in 3 other counties and whose testimony had been formally discredited. It cost money to resolve, and it required Rowan to make a trip to testify that he'd spent 2 months dreading, and when it was done, he came back to the ranch and didn't tell Mara about it for 2 days because he wasn't sure how. When he did tell her, sitting at the kitchen table where they'd sat 1,000 times, she listened to the whole of it without interrupting. The situation he'd been in, the false charge, the 2 years of carrying it. And then she said, "You should have told me." "I know," he said. "Not because I would have—" She stopped. "Not because it would have changed anything, but because carrying things alone when you don't have to is just a habit. A bad one." He looked at her. "Pot and kettle," he said. She thought about that for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Fair." They sat with it for a while, the way they sat with things, not avoiding them, not over-explaining them, just giving them the space they required. "It's done now," she said finally. "It's done," he said. She nodded and reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, the way she did things. Without announcement, without making more of it than it was, just the fact of it, present and real. Then she pulled her hand back and opened the ledger. "The Whitfield family wants to expand their share of the breeding contract," she said. "I need to work the numbers before the meeting Thursday." "I'll do the count on the spring calves tomorrow," he said. "You'll have what you need." "I know I will," she said. By 1890, the Ashcroft Cooperative had 17 member operations across 3 counties. The ranch itself ran over 400 head. The irrigation system had been extended twice more beyond Mara's original 2-phase plan, and the supply contracts, now with 5 agents across the Hill Country and San Antonio, represented one of the larger independent cattle distribution agreements in the southern part of the state. People came from other counties to look at the irrigation design. Mara explained it to anyone who asked, without charge, because she had decided early that the knowledge was worth more circulating than held privately. 3 other ranches built systems based on her plans, and 2 of those modified the design in ways that were genuinely improvements, and she incorporated those modifications into her own channels without ceremony because the goal was water where it needed to be, not credit for the method. Rowan managed the cooperative's logistics, the scheduling, the labor coordination, the practical mechanics of 17 operations working in seasonal concert, with the focused, unshowy competence that had always been his primary quality. He was not a man people told stories about. He was a man things worked around, quietly and consistently, and the distinction mattered more than most people understood. There was a gathering in Callaway Bend in the spring of 1891, a civic occasion of the kind small towns organize when they feel, collectively, that something worth marking has happened in their midst. The occasion was the completion of a county water management agreement that Mara had been central to negotiating, an agreement that established shared water rights protocols for 12 ranching operations along the main creek system and resolved 3 years of low-grade disputes that had been costing everyone money and goodwill. The county commissioner made a short speech. Harvey Dodd, who had been involved in the legal drafting, made a shorter one. And then someone, Rowan never knew exactly who started it, began talking about Mara and what she'd done. And the room found its way to a kind of collective acknowledgement that is not a ceremony and not a speech, but just people saying plainly what they know to be true. Boyd Sumter said that the ranch she'd built had kept his own operation viable through 2 drought years, and he wasn't the only one. Clara Hess said that the cooperative had given her a reason to keep her land instead of selling it to pay debts, and that the land had been in her family for 30 years, and she'd wanted to keep it for 30 more. Tom Garfield said that when he'd first come out to the Ashcroft Ranch with his hat in his hand 3 years ago, he'd expected to be doing Mara Ashcroft a favor by doing business with her, and that this had turned out to be one of the more precisely wrong things he'd believed in his life. Mara sat through this in the particular way she sat through things. Upright, attentive, not performing discomfort and not performing ease, just present. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up and said that the water agreement worked because everyone in the room had decided to make it work, and that the decisions people made about who to trust and what to build together were the only thing that actually moved anything forward, and she was glad to have been part of it. Then she sat down. Rowan beside her said nothing during any of this, because it wasn't his to say. But when the room had moved on to food and conversation, Mara leaned slightly toward him. Just slightly, the half-inch of proximity that was her version of a gesture, and said quietly, "You're not going to say anything?" "About what?" he said. "About—" She paused. "About all that." He looked at her. "You built it," he said. "They're right. What's there for me to say?" She was quiet for a moment. "You stayed," she said, "when everyone expected you to leave. That's—" She stopped, and he knew she was choosing words with her usual precision, making sure what she said was what she meant. That mattered. It still matters. He looked at her. In the noise of the room around them, in the spring evening with its long light coming through the windows of the Callaway Bend Civic Hall, he thought about the $11 and the broken saddle and the 11-minute ceremony and the east fence and the water intake and the burned 40 acres, and every morning he'd gotten up and gone to work on a place that was not his, and then was his, and then was something more complicated than ownership. "I know it did," he said. "That's why I did it." She held his gaze for a moment with the full attention she'd always brought to things that mattered, and something in her face was as open as he'd ever seen it. Not soft. Mara's face didn't really do soft, but honest, which in his experience was worth considerably more. Then Boyd arrived at their table with a plate of food and a question about the spring calving schedule, and the moment passed into the evening the way moments do, absorbed into the ongoing life of 2 people who had too much work to do to make more of anything than it was. What people remembered years later when they told the story of the Ashcroft Ranch, and they did tell it, in the way that frontier communities carry certain stories forward because the stories say something true about what it costs to build a life in difficult country, was not the lawsuit or the settlement or the cooperative agreements or even the irrigation system that changed how water was managed across that part of the county. What they remembered was simpler than all of that. They remembered a woman who had been told, in every way a person can be told, that she was not what was wanted or expected or worth taking seriously. Told it by the town, by the business community, by the social arithmetic of a frontier that had decided what kinds of people and what kinds of bodies were appropriate to the work of building something, and who had looked at all of that and turned back to her numbers, because the numbers were true and the opinions were not, and had kept working. And they remembered a man who had arrived with nothing and had been offered a transaction, a name on paper, 40 acres, 1 year, and who had looked at the terms and then looked at the woman offering them and had made a different choice than the one he'd been hired to make. Not the choice to stay, exactly. The choice to see. To look at what was actually in front of him rather than what the town had decided to see, and to value it accordingly. The ranch they built together was the largest independent cattle operation in that part of Texas by 1895, and it employed 31 people in good years and never fewer than 20 in bad ones. And the cooperative it anchored supported over 40 families across 3 counties. These are the facts that get recorded. But the thing that actually mattered, the thing underneath the numbers, the thing the numbers were built on, was a decision made in the early days of a practical arrangement between 2 people with nothing to lose. The decision to look honestly at what was there, to show up without pretense, and to stay when staying was harder than leaving. Not because anyone was watching, not because the story was going to come out right, just because the work was real and the land was real and the person beside you was real, and that was enough reason. Rowan Hale died in 1903 at 61 of a chest illness that came on in October and was gone by December, the way some things go, faster than you're ready for, leaving behind a specific silence in the rooms where the person used to be. He died on the Ashcroft Ranch, in the east-facing room at the end of the second-floor hall, where he'd sat on his first night and looked out at his 40 acres and felt the provisional weight of a life about to become something he hadn't planned. Mara sat beside him for the last 3 days, the way she did things, without ceremony, without looking away, present in the full and undefended way she'd learned to be present with very few people and had chosen to be present with him. The last thing he said to her on the morning of the 3rd day was not about the ranch or the land or any of the things they'd built. It was, "You were right about the water." She knew what he meant. The irrigation design, the bypass, the channel gradient he'd corrected and she'd confirmed and they'd argued over on a cold October night more than 20 years ago. She knew he meant more than that, too. "I know," she said. He smiled, which he'd always done sparingly and therefore well. And that was enough. Mara Ashcroft ran the ranch for 12 more years after that, until her hands made the ledger work difficult, and her niece, her brother Gerald's youngest daughter, a sharp-eyed young woman named Ruth, who had been working the operation since she was 16, took over the management with the same practical thoroughness that Mara recognized as her own. She lived to 81, which surprised people who had spent decades expecting her to wear out. She didn't wear out. She wore through difficulty and contempt and drought and legal combat and grief and the long, ordinary accumulation of work done right, and came out the other side of all of it still standing, still reading the ledger in the morning, still walking the fence lines of a ranch that had been told it couldn't survive and had simply declined to agree. What she left behind was not a legend, exactly. Legends are for people who were perfect, and she was not perfect, had never claimed to be, had in fact been quite specifically imperfect in ways that anyone who worked alongside her for any length of time could enumerate without difficulty. What she left behind was a place that worked, land that was better managed than it had been found, people whose operations were viable because someone had chosen to share knowledge instead of hoard it, a county water agreement that held for 40 years, and a record, documented in neat, precise handwriting in ledger books that Ruth eventually donated to the County Historical Society, of every fence cut and stake pulled and letter sent and acre burned and decision made and problem solved across 30 years of building something that was not supposed to survive. The record was the point, not to be right, not to be vindicated, not even to be remembered, just to show in the plainest possible language what the work actually was, what it cost and what it produced and who had done it. That's what lasts. Not the reputation, not the respect which comes and goes depending on what people need from you in a given season. Not even the victories, which are always partial and always temporary and always smaller than you hoped and larger than you feared. What lasts is the work itself and the ground it was done on, and the fact, simple and inarguable and requiring no embellishment, that when every force available was pointed at proving it couldn't be done, it was done anyway. Not smoothly, not without cost, not in the way anyone planned, but done.